Hi, this afternoon I thought that I'd talk to you about a very special man, namely my old friend, Wing Commander George Grumpy Unwin. Now, he wasn't grumpy at all, in fact. The nickname arose because they were on readiness at Duxford in 1940 with Douglas Bader, who was filing the top of his tin legs. He got a new pair of legs, making them right dim, which George remonstrated with Bader, and Bader's response was, "Oh, shut up, Grumpy," because Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was a big thing at the time. So that's how the nickname arose. Now, George was an amazing bloke, and during the Battle of Britain, he was a professional airman, he was a flight sergeant, a tough, no-nonsense Yorkshireman, son of a miner, who had the good fortune to go to grammar school. He joined the Royal Air Force as a clerk, and during the expansion scheme of 1936 was able to take advantage of Trenchard's far-sighted scheme of allowing a small number of serving airmen to become fighter pilots. So the idea was that those people would be trained as pilots, and they would fly as pilots for so many years before reverting to their original trades and their original ranks, so that also increased the size of the reserve. So it was quite clever, really. And at a time when society and the services is extremely hierarchical and delineated, this provided a unique opportunity for people from ordinary backgrounds to actually become pilots and fly in the service. Now, George served with 19 Squadron at Duxford before the war, and 19 were of course the RAF's first ever Spitfire Squadron, receiving the Spitfire on the 4th of August 1938, and George had the distinction of being the first NCO pilot to fly a Spitfire. And in fact, shortly after that, he had an engine problem and had to make a forced landing at Sudbury in Essex. But the problem was it was a school playing field and there were children on the field, so in George's words, I just stuffed the Spitfire into a hedge. But there must have been a lot more to it than that, because he got an air officer's commendation for that skillful bit of airmanship. But by the time of the Battle of Britain, George was a very experienced pilot. He'd flown over Dunkirk, scored victories, and during the Battle of Britain, there's no doubt that although 19 Squadron was up in 12 Group, and therefore not one of the squadrons engaged on a daily basis down in the southeast, 19 was still a part of the Duxford Big Wing and saw action over London, over the southeast, and particularly over the Thames Estuary area. And on the 7th of September, George flew with the wing for the first time that Bader led off this wing, and it was the first day that the Germans bombed London round the clock. So the problem was that the wing got bounced by high-flying German fighters while it was on the climb, so not the greatest situation to be in. But nonetheless, there was enormous combat, and George, in fact, I'll read it to you because it's just so good. And I covered all of this in Spitfire, the very substantial, it's like a paving slab, this book, about 19 Squadron between 38 and 41. But what George says in his combat report, and this is typical of the man, he says, between Ramsgate and London, Grumpy found himself in Spitfire P9546, surrounded by ME-109s, typically and instantly deciding attack was the best form of defence. Now, this is what George says. The usual fight ensued, during which I definitely hit at least 5 of them, but only 2 were definitely shot down, both in flames. I then climbed for a breather and shadowed the 3rd enemy formation when I saw yet a 4th arriving. By this time, 2 of the other 3 formations had turned north, and the other went straight on in a northwesterly direction. The leading formation turned east, and I was at 25,000 feet above them. As there did not seem to be any of their escorts left, I dived on the rear Vickers bombers and gave them the rest of my ammunition, about 50 rounds in each gun, and at about 450 to 500 yards range. The aircraft wobbled but carried on, and I returned home. So back at Falmere, which is where 19 Squadron was based then during the Battle of Britain, George is credited with 2 ME-109s destroyed in that action. And then a few days later, on the 11th of September, George is flying P9546 again. Now, this is interesting. Obviously, this is George with his ever-present Alsatian flash, and another pilot who flew P9546 was Wallace Cunningham, Jock Cunningham. Another ace, well-known pilot, and Jock got a 109 in P9546 over St Margaret's Bay near Dover. So this aircraft, it's being flown by a number of pilots, but particularly these two, and especially George, QVH P9546. So on the 7th of September, George gets 2 109s in P9546, and then on the 11th of September, he gets shot down in it. So George is attacking a Dornier 17 bomber, and in his words, which he says, I was at about 20,000 feet flying my usual Spitfire P9546 QVH, and I suddenly saw this lone Dornier. How he was on his own I'll never know, but he was off home. So I went after him. Now the drill against the Dornier was he had a dustbin rear gunner, a dustbin hanging down below the fuselage, and so you had to fix him first before closing in for the aircraft. This I did, very cleverly of course. I could see him shooting at me, and so closed in and gave him a burst and shot him up. At least I thought I had. I'll never know to this day whether I did or didn't, or whether someone took his place. Because as I closed right in on him and started shooting, I saw this rear gunner shooting back at me. The little red sparks you could see. I didn't pay much attention to it, thinking that after a quick spray from the spread of my guns he would stop. I carried on firing for quite a while, when suddenly I was covered in smoke. To my horror, a hole appeared in my windscreen. I was leaning forward, of course, one did, to peer through the gun sight, which was fortunately in the middle of a piece of armour-plated, bullet-resistant glass, about 1.5 inches thick. A hole appeared in front of my face. I thought, good God, I must be dead, or something. No blood, no nothing, but I'm covered in smoke. I thought I was on fire, so I whipped the hood back, undid my straps, and started to get out. Well, to cut a long story short, George isn't on fire, and he gets back in the aircraft and lands it wheels down to save damage to the aircraft in a field near Brentwood in Essex, not far from North Weald. So personnel are dispatched from North Weald, and George, with the help of a fitter plus spares, manages to repair the damage. It's a coolant pipe, I think, in the engine that had been damaged. So manages to repair it and flies off back to Falmere. Ultimately, the Spitfire had to go away for repair because of the damage to the windscreen, which couldn't be repaired on the station. And later, it went off to an operational training unit, number 5 operational training unit at Stroud, Aston Down near Stroud in Gloucestershire, where unfortunately it broke up in midair and killed the Canadian pilot, a chap called Unwin Davis. Now, when Jock Cunningham was flying this aircraft, he was shot up by a 109, and the main spar was damaged. So you'd have to ask yourself whether that damage actually ultimately contributed to the aircraft suddenly deciding to break up, because it's not exactly a commonplace occurrence, is it? So anyway, poor old Unwin Davis was killed. Now, coincidentally, the Spitfire crashed not that far from where I live. It crashed a little village called Dimmock in Gloucestershire. And some years ago now, my friends and I, excavated the crash site and found quite a lot of small bits and pieces. Now, the great thing about this, I think, is that to have a tangible connection with the past, you don't need half an aeroplane, you don't need a museum, you don't need engines galore and goodness knows what. It doesn't matter what it is, it doesn't matter how big it is, how small it is, just so long it is an artifact, an item from the past. So what we did, we got some of these items cleaned up by Dr. Dennis Williams, who was a metallurgist and used to do a fantastic job conserving these items, and mounted them on a model of QVH P9546, and that one was presented to Jock Cunningham himself at the launch of my book, A Few of the Many. It was to Guildhall back in, it was the 50th anniversary of VE Day, so that was 95. And George also had a plaque with some items on. Now, the other thing I was able to do was I was doing some work for Corgi, the die-cast model manufacturer at the time, and this would be 2006. So I persuaded them to make a limited edition model in 1/32 scale of P9546, and I think, if memory serves me rightly, it comes complete with a little figure of George and Flash the Alsatian, and George was absolutely delighted with this model. Sadly, he died not long after that presentation was made, and that photograph was taken at his retirement flat in Wimborne, Ferndown, Dorset. And I lost a good friend when George died, because George had come to all of my events over the years, and I can even remember arguing with him at Duxford when he's insisting on carrying boxes of books out of the van for a book signing we were going to do. I mean, he just pitched himself totally into it. And with the P9546 thing, he was absolutely rooting for us to be able to do this little recovery and investigate the site. In fact, I quoted some of his letters about it in the new book, Letters from the Few. But he was a tremendously enthusiastic person, and just a really special individual, I always thought. And after the war, well, after the Battle of Britain, George was quite old then. He was 27. He was quite old to be a fighter pilot. So he was shunted off into training command with his great friend Harry Steer. But they managed to talk their way back onto operations eventually, flying Mosquitoes on night intruder operations during the build-up to Normandy, D-Day. But sadly, Harry was killed in June 1944. But George survived, and having been awarded a Distinguished Flying Medal in the Battle of Britain, he went on to be, well, he'd been commissioned by the end of the war anyway, but he went on to rise through the ranks to command a brigand squadron in the Malayan emergency, for which he received, or he was appointed to the Distinguished Service Order, and eventually retired as a wing commander. And after, and in retirement, played an awful lot of golf down at Ferndown. But sadly, George is no longer with us. Now, I had the most amazing honour, as I have with a number, sadly, of these old friends amongst the few, of being asked to speak at George's funeral, which I did, and it was an extremely moving occasion and experience. And after the funeral, the family, George's brother, very kindly gave me back the plaque of the P9546 artefacts that we presented to George all those years before. So this is very special to me, and this is a little wheel that fits the pilot's armour plate, so it can be adjusted at the back of his head. There's just a bit of airframe there, part of the old fasteners, piece of engine casing, and this is from an instrument bezel, so it's for calibrating the instrument at the back. So that is a real piece of history. It's not a massive Merlin engine, it's just a few little bits of history that was part of a Spitfire that was in the Battle of Britain, that shot down Messerschmitt 109s engaged German bombers, was shot down itself and force landed, and very sadly, ultimately, broke up in midair, killing the Canadian pilot. So that's a real piece of history, and I just wanted to share it with you. I've got some other things like this which I'm going to talk about over the next few days, and I hope you enjoy listening to it, because they are unique and they're stories that we need to keep recording, and we need to ensure that we maintain the currencies. So Spitfire P9546 QVH and George Unwin 19 Squadron all the way.